I read what Milton Friedman had to say at the time, and I couldn't see the driving force behind it. I could see how the equations worked. I couldn't see how the cause and effect worked, so to speak. And that was the big issue. So I wasn't particularly happy with that. As part of my reading, I read, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and so forth, and I quite liked what Smith had to say generally. I know he's generally thought of as a rather right-wing writer, but when you actually read it, the thing I always think with Adam Smith is that the problem isn't so much Smith himself, it's his fans. He's a lot less right-wing than they are. It does become apparent when you actually read what he has to say, as opposed to, what, as I say, his fans generally have to say.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today I talk with Derek Ross on the basics of Georgism and its relationship to MMT. Derek's a Nova Scotia resident who's been a chorus member in theatrical productions for 4 decades, in shows such as The Pirates of Penzance by Gilbert and Sullivan. He and his wife also run a bed and breakfast. Derek was especially helpful in providing feedback for an introductory presentation I developed early this year. Although unfortunately the presentation never came together, it has many valuable concepts and analogies I still use today. Derek and I met in the Facebook group Intro to MMT, which is very busy and has more than 6,000 people, and for which I'm a moderator. Derek first discovered Georgism and later the work of Steve Keen, which ultimately led him to MMT. A main insight of Georgism is that taxing land is a much more elegant way to make a system that's both fair and more difficult to exploit. Although humans can manipulate and destroy buildings, they can't eliminate the land those buildings are on. As an example, I have a friend who's a general contractor. He tore down an old house and built a new one for his daughter. However, he left one wall in the old building standing, which prevented it from being legally considered as new construction, thereby avoiding extra fees and newer regulations. Land as defined by Georgism is not just the earth, but conceptual, like internet URLs and the bandwidth for television, radio, and cell phones. Taxes, or rents on that land, can be paid with money, such as interest for a bank loan or taxes for living in a country. They can also be paid with not money, such as by having to provide a certain amount of labor to the king each year or a percentage of the harvest. Going beyond Georgism, physics makes it clear that the most fundamental resource is energy. Resources and we are essentially forms of energy. In addition, all energy requires energy to find, gather, and process it. How you find, gather, and process food is very different than how you find, gather, and process gold, which is very different than how you do it for labor. Derek's provided several resources for those interested in learning more, and you can find links to these things in the show notes. Before the heart of our conversation, however, the first half of today's episode, part 1, is about the non-economic topics of music and musical theater. I'm a classically trained singer, and then solar panels and electric cars. Part 2 next week is entirely academic. If you like what you hear, then I hope you might consider becoming a monthly patron of Activist MMT. Patrons get super early access to almost every episode, and they also get the opportunity to ask my academic guests questions, and they support the development of my large and growing collection of Learn MMT resources, among other things. To become a patron, you can start by going to patreon.com/activistmmt. Every little bit helps a little bit, and it all adds up to a lot. Thanks. And now, on to my conversation with Derek Ross. Enjoy.
Okay, you hear me?
I can, yes.
All right. Derek, thank you so much for coming on. It is really nice talking with you. We have spoken many times in Facebook Messenger and on intro, so thank you for coming on and taking the time to talk with me.
Well, that's very welcome. I mean, what else do you do on a wet Sunday?
Okay. So the first thing I want to ask you is, you are an actor, and I believe it's safe to say a singer. And I'm curious to hear about that. Do you know that I sing?
Yeah, I did. Well, it's just something I've always done. I mean, I've never done it for cash. It's always been for fun. But I started at school, and I think with, a few minor exceptions, I haven't really stopped in the last 40 years or so.
Wow.
And the sort of roles I get nowadays in musical theatres are a little bit different from what I got as a young man, but it's still just as entertaining for me anyway. Don't know what the audience would think, but I enjoy myself.
And are you trained in any way?
No, not really. I generally just take chorus parts and small parts. I think the most recent thing that I did sounds a lot better than I guess it really was, but we did Cavalleria Rusticana in the Lunenburg Opera House, which was a bit of a change for me because I'm normally used to doing either musicals or comic opera in English. So the first time I had to sing through something classical in Italian. But when it comes to foreign languages, Italian is definitely one of the easier ones, I think, for English speakers to at least make a reasonable attempt at pronunciation on. So, it was good. I enjoyed it.
And what was the name of this show?
Cavalleria Rusticana. It's a 19th century Italian opera. It's basically a big melodrama. It's got all the normal operatic things, sort of jealousy, murder, illegitimate pregnancies and all the rest of it. It all compressed into one act, so it doesn't waste any time.
Okay, and what do you really enjoy as far as shows and music?
Well, what I normally enjoy doing is the comic operas, Gilbert and Sullivan, sort of thing. And basically because, A, it is in English, and most audiences enjoy things more when it's in their native language. And B, it's got a lot of very 19th century jokes, let me say. So they're not exactly going to make you fall out laughing, but they're amusing. Exactly. Certainly, Gilbert was quite clever in his writing. If you like witty writing, then it's pretty good. And Sullivan's music, well, it's a taste that different people have different opinions on. But for myself, I think he was pretty good.
Okay. I don't know it very well, but the one thing I know rather well by Gilbert and Sullivan is "I Am the Very Model." By Pirates of Penzance, right?
Yeah, that's the popular one. Well, it is a good song. There's no doubt about it. Hence why people have done so many sort of takeoffs of it and whatnot. Gilbert thought nobody would miss them if they were gone, so to speak. Basically, because the Mikado is very much about crime and punishment in a lot of ways, and particularly about sort of the fact that quite often the punishment does not fit the crime. The idea, though, that basically, if you're looking for people to execute, these are the people. So, of course, that's being used quite a lot as well in sort of modern political life or whatever, to talk about people who exploit.
That's the Mikado?
The Mikado, yes. Which is, it's, in a sense, it's about, let me say it's set in Japan. It's really about the law, and which was Gilbert's hobby horse, really. And he was trained as a lawyer, and he used a lot of legal reasoning in his operas, basically showing how absurd the law often can be. And in The Mikado, things are pretty absurd. Basically, a man, for reasons which make some sense within the opera, ends up becoming the head executioner, mostly because he's been condemned to die by beheading, and the townspeople want him to be the beheader, because none of them can be punished for a crime until he's executed, and he can't execute himself, of course, as head executioner. So it's quite a clever way of resolving a problem for them.
I'm a very model. I'm the model of a modern. I am the very model of a modern Major General. To me, I mean, I don't really know Gilbert and Sullivan that well, but that particular song, I love. I think it's amazing, and it really seems to me like that's their version of rap.
Yes.
Like, yeah, it's just the pitter pat, and it's even ragtime piano, I think, kind of fits somehow in there. I don't know, that I associate that a little bit to that as well. Just a real pitter pat, fast, complicated.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. But the technical term for it is patter song, but you're quite right. It basically is 19th century rap. And the idea was always to sing it as fast as possible.
Right.
The other big one, which again I don't know how familiar most people are with it, is the one which was from Ruddy Gore and often used in Pirates, which was "It Doesn't Really Matter," which again is sung so fast that, generally speaking, you've got to be listening pretty carefully if you're actually going to hear the words. And in fact, the song itself makes fun of that fact. The words don't really matter because you can't hear them.
Interesting. And it's not just the listener, the challenge for the listener, it's a challenge for the person saying it. You have to have...
Absolutely.
I mean, it's intense. It is very intense. In fact, there's a song by Weird Al Yankovic called Hardware Store. And in the middle of the song is the bridge where he just runs through a ridiculous list of products. Like, he worships a hardware store. Like, that's like Disney World for him. And so he like lists, look at all this stuff. Like, he's in the store and he says, look at all this stuff. And then he goes through this, like, I'm actually doubting that he actually did it without, speeding it up or something. But but on the other hand, he's done some pretty extraordinary stuff. So maybe, I don't know, but I can't do it. I can't, like, even practicing as hard as I can, I cannot say it clearly. So
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll share that with you later.
No, absolutely. Al was a pretty amazing guy. I must admit. I take my hat off to him. The things that himself able to do are very impressive.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for him. I really like him a lot, and he puts on a good show too. He's a lot of fun. So, okay, last question about theater and music. Has your tastes changed since? Are your tastes now different than they were when you were younger?
Well, a little bit. I think if you take my wider taste in music, sort of from pop through to classical, it has changed from the point of view that I now have a bit more respect for music of the 1970s than I did when I was growing up. I always thought I liked what was done in the 1960s when I was like below the age of 10 sort of thing. I also liked what was done in the 1980s, when I was sort of in my 20s, 30s. But yeah, I was never very impressed with most of what went on with the 1970s music. I think now I have slightly changed my opinion on that, just from the point of view that there was actually a reasonable amount of good music done in that time. it's just that, when you're actually living in the time, you get exposed to everything. And there was a lot of bad music, in my opinion. But looking back, I can see there's some stuff that's definitely I like better now than I did then. I don't know that my musical tastes have changed hugely over the years. I mean, I quite like rock music. I do like traditional folk music a lot. Not so much the people who write music in the folk tradition, but I mean actually the older 19th and 18th century stuff that people still play. So stuff like, I don't know, Steel Eye Span or Airport Convention or the various Scottish groups like the Corries or McCallums. I wasn't so familiar with them when I was younger, but I have grown to like them a lot over the years. I'm pretty eclectic as far as music goes. I mean, there is some good in just about any area if you look for it, and there's some bad. It's just a question of going for the good and avoiding the bad when you come down to it. I mean, I'm just as likely to sort of listen to ABBA as I am to Led Zeppelin type of thing. I wouldn't say I have tastes that are particularly specific. I don't really love any genre of music or hate any genre particularly. I would just say there are probably fewer country songs that I like than ones I dislike. But if you look around, you'll find good music anywhere.
Okay. I'm a classically trained singer, and so, but I don't choose to listen to classical music. I enjoy it, I can respect it, but I don't choose to listen to it. And I can enjoy singing it too. But it's kind of, this is not exactly right, but just kind of roughly, it's kind of more of a technical exercise, a technical excitement, a technical, it's exciting because I can do it as opposed to, I think it's beautiful. I mean, that's really rough, but just kind of, but I kind of wish that I was more trained with more popular concentration than, in a way it was good because, in a way it was really good because I think being trained classically has made me a more, it gives you more flexibility and power. But on the other hand, I wish I focused more of that more deliberately on music that I really wanted to focus on rather than just classical. So anyway.
I think, that's a teaching focus again, though. I know I have a music teacher friend in Calgary who, again, like yourself, classically trained, and, she'll keep you absolutely right as far as singing opera is concerned. But she also fronts, a rock cover band. So she changes her voice style to do that. There's no doubt. But when she does, she sounds as if she, was made to front a rock band. And yet, if you hear her, doing color pure soprano, because that's basically what she can do, then she sounds great at that too.
That's actually much closer to the point that I wanted to make, is that she can sing like she's destroying her voice, but not destroy her voice. Like she knows how to sound like she's singing rough in a way that doesn't actually hurt her voice. That's what classically trained gives you.
Exactly.
Yeah, like Pat Benatar, I believe, is classically trained, and she sings really rough in some of her songs in a good way, in a good style. But I think being classically trained allows you to do that. And actually, in order to, I can sing really bad. You have to be really you have to be a really good singer to sing super bad. Like, hold like a dissonant note, like purposefully, you know what I mean? Like
I'm making it sound realistic, yeah.
Yeah, and I am working on a quiz related to economics having nothing to do with music, and I compose the questions and the correct answers and the explanations, and I have a friend who I actually would suspect that you would know, John Wilson, his name is on the intro. He's a lawyer, he's a super smart guy, and he writes the wrong answers, and some of the wrong answers are so wrong, they're like comically wrong, and I'm like, this guy has to be really smart to be that dumb, like that, because he writes the wrong answers. He's supposed to fool people. He's supposed to, so I don't know, it's just really funny to me. Anyway, okay. All right, great. So if there's anything else you wanted to say regarding music, say it, and then I'm going to move on to something else.
Absolutely. No, there's nothing really. I mean, I really enjoy what I'm singing. I'm not the world's greatest singer. I generally sing in tune, but no, I'm not classically trained, so I have to be careful with what I do. And my biggest problem is I only go up to E, and even most of the baritone roles are a bit tricky for me. Really, it needs to be bass, otherwise I'm stuck.
So you're a bass? You're a low baritone and a bass?
Yeah, low baritone. Yeah, as I say, sort of the E, just above middle C is basically. I've got a break there. That's a drawback, and
wow.
I guess
Okay.
It could be trained out of me, sort of thing, because I can do the E sharp and the F above it, but there's that point. And the problem is, as a baritone, if you're doing solo parts, I think quite often baritones are expected to go up to E, F, even G, sort of occasionally. So, there's quite a few parts which basically I can't do just because I'd have to speak the top bit.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I can get down to a D2, so that's pretty good.
A D2, below the staff, below the bass clef?
Below the bass clef, yeah, that's right.
Whoa, okay. I cannot do that. I'm a tenor 1. I mean, I'm a high tenor 2. Like if I really warm up, I can be a tenor 1. But I can also do countertenor. I can also do some. I used to be able to do it super high, like higher than my soprano friends. Wow. But I can still do it pretty high, but not quite that high anymore. But
that means most of the the general sort of like range of songs that are around, you could do a pretty good stab at. Your range is just right for a lot of the male songs.
Well, I mean that is good, but it's also even better that I know how to take a song and lower it. Like I have the audio technology, knowledge to be able to take a song and then lower it a little bit to make it what I need it to be. So, okay, great. So I have another question, and this is just kind of a weird thing that I noticed on your timeline. I'm just curious to hear a brief summary of the story, and then we'll get on to more proper economics, and that is. You did something really interesting with your house. You built you built a floor on top of your roof, but did not disassemble the roof until after the floor was built on top of it. Can you tell that story? I believe I got that right?
Oh, right. I know what you're talking about. Yes, I'm actually sitting in that floor now. Well, technically that wasn't me. That was our building contractor. But what happened was we moved into this house in Nova Scotia, which is a very nice house and in a lovely location on the banks of a river. Far enough back that we're not going to get flooded, but close enough that, it's at the bottom of the garden. And that was great. But the house is basically a 1940s house, so the insulation isn't great in it. The storage space isn't good in it, And we came from a rather larger house in Calgary, so we needed some extra space. What we did was one part of the house had been already added on to in the 1970s and had been built as a one-story unit. So what we did was we added another story on the top. And in order to do that, basically we had to remove the existing roof and put in new rafters to take the new floor and all the rest of it and build a second story on top. So that is basically why we built a floor instead of on top of a roof. But the roof was taken out once the new rafters were in place. But that added on 2 extra rooms and a bit of storage. Partly because, again, we had 1940s plumbing. I am amazed that they managed to get a full bath and a wash-hand basin and toilet bowl into a space which was basically a large cupboard. Although it was, as I say, quite impressive, it really wasn't something that I wanted to use. So we knocked into the next door bedroom and expanded the bathroom. But of course that took a bedroom away, and it was only like a 3-bedroom house anyway. So we wanted to keep it as a 3-bedroom house, which is why we wanted to do the extra floor. But that's the joys of moving into a new house, which is an old house, I guess. And we've had a lot to do with it. the thing that I've been happiest with, my wife liked the new rooms, and we've made good use of them. And we've basically been running bed and breakfast here for the last 3 years, and met a whole lot of very interesting people as a result. Been pretty good. But the thing that I liked best in the way of improvements you've done is you put solar panels on the roof, because nice. The electricity bills were quite high, and this house basically is all electric. So I wanted to get them down. And looking at it, I was looking at the returns that I was getting on my investments in the stock market lately. They haven't been great over the last few years. And I thought, well, if I put the money into solar panels instead, I could maybe reduce my electricity bill by more. And that is how it's worked out. Basically, I'm getting a better return off the solar panels on the roof than the money was giving when, it was part of my investments. So that's great. We're now at the stage where basically we don't really pay an electricity bill. It's a connection fee to the electricity network. Because I didn't go down the totally self-contained, battery route. Instead, the solar panels, basically during the day, I supply electricity to the power company. During the night, they supply electricity to me. That way I don't need to worry about looking after batteries or running out of power or whatever. But I still get the savings on the electricity. So that's
interesting. It's like what do you call it? It's like a kind of a buffer stock in a way. You are powering other people in exchange for them powering you.
That's right. That's exactly it. It means that the power company doesn't need to run their quite so many of their high cost power stations. The natural gas quick run up stuff during the day, because my electricity is going out to people who are sort of cooking and whatever at home. And then in the evening, well, I don't need to worry about batteries, because basically the power is coming back in to me. I mean, that may change in the future, because one of the annoying things is I am pretty rural here, and we do get power cuts, not often, but at least once a year, just because of snow on the lines or whatever. It's all above ground electricity supply here, and when the trees grow over, and there's an awful lot of trees in Nova Scotia, so they grow over, then they lie in the line and break them every now and again. So it would be nice to have batteries, so we didn't have to worry about that. But that's for the future. I'll look at that.
Interesting.
The other thing we have done just recently, and we've only done it last month, is we capitalized on it a little bit further by getting an electric car. So that basically has been run off the solar panels as well. So
what kind?
A Hyundai. Yeah, Hyundai.
A Hyundai. Okay.
Yeah.
Purely electric or hybrid?
No, it's totally electric. It's basically a Kona, but they've replaced the petrol engine with an electric motor. And it's fine. I mean, no complaints about the performance and whatnot. It's really good. The range is a bit less than the petrol one. Yeah, that's fair enough. But generally speaking, I mean, most of my stuff is, I'm not doing long trips in it. If I want to go a long way, I fly anyway, So it's good for running about. It'll take me up to Halifax, which is about an hour and a half from me, and is even the big city in Nova Scotia sort of thing, where you might want to go if you want to go night out the theatre or whatever. And if the car takes me there and back, great, fine, I'm happy.
Okay, great. Okay, well, why don't we move on to, can you describe your thinking before you understood MMT or reality economics, real world economics?
I do. Basically, I have always been interested in how the economy works, just because as a long-term fan of engineering, so to speak, I like to know how everything works, if possible. So I started looking into economics as a happy amateur, you might say, back in the 1970s. And at that time, the Keynesians were still basically in charge, but they were losing their grip, and the more modern neoclassical economists were beginning to hold sway. So most of what I learned at the time, it made some sense, but I found that in particular money wasn't well explained. I read what Milton Friedman had to say at the time, and I couldn't see the driving force behind it. I could see how the equations worked. I couldn't see how the cause and effect worked, so to speak. And that was the big issue. So I wasn't particularly happy with that. As part of my reading, I read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and so forth, and I quite liked what Smith had to say generally. I know he's generally thought of as a rather right-wing writer, but when you actually read it, the thing I always think with Adam Smith is that the problem isn't so much Smith himself, it's his fans. He's a lot less right-wing than they are. It does become apparent when you actually read what he has to say, as opposed to, what, as I say, his fans generally have to say. But the good thing I did get out of that was classical economists like Adam Smith concentrate a lot on natural resources. They don't just talk about capital and labour, as you might suspect if you look at what most Marxists have to say about economics, and what most neoclassical economists have to say about it too. But the traditional economists like Ricardo and Smith and the physiocrats generally, what they say, generally speaking, is still the case. It gave me the idea at the time, certainly, that in economics there are two sorts of goods. There's the ones that men can produce, the ones we make ourselves, and the ones which, although they may be essential, we can't produce. The things that are, in a sense, given to us by nature. So for instance, the ground we walk on, the energy that comes from the sun and so forth. And these are things which we need, absolutely, but we can't make them. We can only collect, what's available already. No, that's not to say that, it's not, we don't need things that we make as well. We absolutely do. But there is this difference between things that we must have but don't make, and things which we must have but we do make. And I think that was the big thing that I took out of what I read certainly before I came across MMT. Because of that, that's why I quite like my readings from Henry George and so forth about why it is important to distribute items sort of in a just manner. I think the fact is that we're all born into a world which was there before there were men, and which, although we have changed it, we didn't really create it in the first place. And it does seem unjust that, in a sense, because of that, we don't, although we're born in, we don't get to make use of some parts of it because somebody who was born earlier sort of grabbed it first, so to speak. So because of that, I took out of that, the classical economists and Henry George, the importance of the idea of rent. We collect things, basically. We are people who collect things, and we don't have much option in some cases but to collect what is there and what we're allowed to. And because of the private ownership of certain parts of the natural world, we can't collect some things that are essential to our survival. We can breathe the air; it's free. Drinking the water, that's a bit trickier because the water may well belong to somebody else.
The air comes to us essentially. The water we, in a sense, have to go to.
Yeah, we have to go to. It's on somebody's land. And perhaps that land, owner doesn't want to share their water with other people. It does happen. Yeah, it was an important way of looking at the world, and because of that, I did see why taxation was important in particular. I didn't understand taxation in the same way that I did after I came across MMT. But even at that time, I could see that basically there isn't a lot of difference between a rent and a tax, from the point of view that, they're both collecting money, generally speaking, from one person to another. And the collector doesn't necessarily do that much work in collecting the money from the tenant or the taxpayer, and not as much work as the taxpayer or tenant might have to do to actually collect the money themselves to give to the other person. So that was basically my thinking. One of the things that does come out of that is that rents and taxes in many ways are very similar sort of things. If you basically increase the amount of money that's spent on taxes, there's less left to spend on rents. So the possibility of, maybe the possibility is the wrong word, but the potential is there for to make the economy run better by increasing taxes and reducing rents. And if the one does the other, then you can basically fund the government using the old ideas without necessarily costing the general public much more than they would have to pay if there were no taxes at all.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm not explaining that very well, but yeah, the idea is that taxes and rents basically come from the same place, and if you increase one, you're going to reduce the other. Does it make sense?
Well, it hopefully will make more sense. But let me ask for now. Let me ask, what was the timing between each? Meaning, what was the sequence of what you learned when? As far as which you discovered first and which influenced the other, and so on.
Okay. To give a bit more of a timeline, I think I got my first basic economics education, you might say, just in the late 1970s when I was doing an engineering course, and we were looking at sort of time discounting on money. When you're looking at costing things, I read on my own, say, the Adam Smith stuff at the beginning of the 80s, and not long afterwards, I came across the ideas of Georgism in the public library in Dundee in the early 1980s. I'd already been sort of primed, in a sense, by looking around Dundee, which is an industrial city in the UK in the early 1980s, and like many, had a lot of very rough spots, which had at one time been warehouses and whatever, and now weren't. And it always struck me as strange that the property taxes at that time were set up so that you only paid a property tax on a building that was complete, which seemed strange to me because it was incentivizing people to destroy buildings in order to reduce their tax bills. And that's exactly what people did.
Yeah, actually, if I may, a quick aside, which is, I have a friend who's a contractor, and he avoided the consequences and costs of new construction by destroying a home for his daughter and building a new one, like destroying an old home and building a new one for his daughter, but he left one wall standing, which legally made it not new construction. So he could get away with avoiding all of those things. So go on.
It is crazy what the incentives do. I mean, they really do work, taxation incentives, but they don't always produce the result that they were intended to by the legislators, let us say. But they absolutely work. Yeah, they absolutely do. And as I say, it was obvious to me in the city of Dundee at the time, that it really wasn't working very well, which is part of the reasons why I was reading up to try and find out a bit more about how. I mean, I now understand, that the right way to do it really is you don't tax the building that goes onto the land, you tax the actual land itself, because, people can destroy the building if they want to avoid tax. And that's not really a good thing, because, buildings are useful, even if they do need to be maintained. But they can't really destroy the actual location. It's there. And if they don't want to pay tax on it, then they should sell it to somebody, who is prepared to pay the tax on it, so to speak. Because that way the land stays in use. And, it's like earning, how much earning money, it's producing, real resources for people's use. But, as I say, it was that sort of thing that really pushed me to start reading that. And I found that very interesting. I do see why Georgism does talk about the land rent so much. It's a bit of a misnomer to say it's the only thing, because if you actually do read Henry George's work on it, it really does apply to all rents. So the rents that banks make when they rent out money to you, the rents which patent owners make when they license the use of their patents, it's all rent, and in principle it could all be taxed. The only reason really for concentrating so much on land tax by most Georgists, and it's a good reason I think, is that it's very difficult to hide the ownership of land. The land is there. Even if you don't know who the owner is, you know that somebody has to own it. You know that it's not just sitting there unused and unowned. Because of that, it's quite easy to foreclose on it. A bit more difficult to foreclose on things which are movable off to tax havens.
Bits of information as opposed to,
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as I say, the Georgists tend to push the land tax thing, basically because it's one of the biggest sources of rent in the economy. But they're fully aware that it's not the only source of rent. I mean, if you wanted, I could certainly go into detail about other big sources, from broadcast spectrum, through, as I say, to IP rents as well. But if anybody's interested in that, I'm sure they can go and have a look.
Well, okay, so you discovered Georgism long before you discovered the other stuff. So I wonder, describe how you discovered MMT, and then also, how did it validate Georgism, and what did it reveal that might not be correct about Georgism? Like, and how did they enhance each other? How did they criticize each other? So,
well, the path to get to MMT, basically, as I say, I was fairly happy with Georgism's explanation of how rents and taxes work generally. What I wasn't quite so happy about is it still doesn't really explain money that well. Things like inflation and so forth, it's not clear how that could come about as a result of the sort of stuff that Henry George talks about, and Adam Smith as well. Smith actually, in many ways, is better on money. George didn't really concentrate on that very much, and that's fine. I mean, we all have to choose what we think is important and talk about it, and he did. And as I say, I'm very happy with it. Aligns with my understanding of what works in economics. But it really is about the real resources side of economics, and it is also, I would say, more about the private sector side of economics. It doesn't really explain the role of government particularly, and it doesn't really explain the role of money either. It does use money from the point of view you are talking about rents and taxes, but it doesn't give that driving force particularly, I think, that is missing from a lot of the sort of mainstream economic story.
If I may, I'd like to interject one thing, which is taxing is obviously done with money. So if you can change the meaning of money, then you basically have infinite control over, you can't control that. The Georgist ideas can't be controlled if you don't have control over the definition of money. Like if money can change out from under you, then...
I understand what you're saying, Jeff. What I would say is that it is possible to change the definition of money. For instance, in feudal times, if you had to provide, sort of like, say, 20% of your egg production and that sort of thing, then the egg is basically the rent that's being given to the landlord at that point. The thing is, yes, I mean, we do normally think of rents nowadays in terms of money, but that's because most of what we do is collecting money and passing it on to other people. There aren't so many of us who are specifically, sort of like growing cabbages in the back garden and then having to, hand over 20 cabbages a month or whatever it is to the bank. But the fact is that the rents don't have to be paid in money. There is an argument for saying that whatever you use to pay a rent or a tax is money. But I mean, you get situations like in ancient times with Egypt, where ancient Egypt had two forms of taxation, neither of which were monetary. The one being forced labour, or, well, let's say, labour as tax, corvée as we call it, which means that basically, you don't have to pay the king, but you do have to work, sort of 50 hours out of the year for him or whatever it happens to be, So the thing is that both money and rent and taxes, they don't have to be like based on pounds or dollars or whatever. They generally are nowadays, but historically, we can see that they haven't always been.
Okay, so forgive me for distracting you from when you discovered MMT and how they informed each other, how Georgism and MMT informed each other.
How they informed? Well, first of all, if I just finish off by saying about my path, because I wasn't that happy with what Georgism was saying about money, I have always kept looking because I'm always interested in learning more from what's been out there. And I came across Steve Keen, first of all, and his ideas on banking and money, which I still think are pretty good. But that led me through to discover Stephanie Kelton and then the other MMTers at the time as well, around 2008, 2009.
Okay.
So I looked into that, and I very much like the story. The basic ideas behind MMT. Those did explain money very well to me, I thought. Basically, we're still back in the realms of collecting things for ordinary people. It's just that we're collecting government tokens nowadays instead of, collecting, food in the wild or apples in the trees or whatever it is. Mm. And I particularly liked, the full explanation that they gave. That tied in well because it explained to me how the money thing worked, both for landlords in the private sector and for the government. It also explains a lot to me about how the things work with the foreign sector, with imports and exports, where we basically have people who they're not taxed, and yet they still regard the dollar or the pound or whatever it is as being valuable, even though they themselves have no taxes to pay. The basic reason they do that is because they can exchange that token, which they cannot create, for goods which they do value and which they do require. And that tied in quite well with Georgism because it explained how the rental side sort of worked. I mean, why is it that modern landlords don't want 10% of the grain harvest or 500 hours of labour from you in payment for use of their land? It's because they can get it as money instead, as the tokens which they need to pay taxes, which they themselves are paying to a higher authority in the same way that their tenants are paying them. And when you look at it like that, then you can actually look at the whole of society as different groups of people who are basically collecting things and passing them on to other people because they need them, or consuming them themselves, again, because they need them. So as I say, when I came across those ideas in 2008, yes, that made a lot of sense. And it's covering a different area of economics from the Georgist side, which really is more about the private sector in a sense and how it distributes resources. But when you add MMT into the mix, you've now got like a complete economy, or a complete description of a modern economy, because you've got the government sector as well. So it all made sense to me. And basically, you can look on, from a Georgist point of view, you can look on the government as being the prime landlord for the country as a whole, and the taxes which it levies as being, the rent you pay for living in the country.
So you said from a what point of view it could be viewed that way?
Oh, I was saying from a Georgist point of view, you can look on MMT as describing how the landlord is, the government is the prime landlord, who basically expects to be paid in its tokens for the use of its resources.
That kind of implies that Georgism is too narrow, meaning it's accurate within its own world, but it's like when you see descriptions of banks create money, but you don't pull out and see the foot. It's basically being too narrow focused. It's basically, it doesn't matter how accurate my theories are within my own home. If I don't leave my home, then I'm not considering all of the effect that the entire world has on me. It's one thing to be accurate within your own bubble, but if you don't pull back and see how the rest of the world impacts that bubble and how you impact the rest of the world, then how meaningful can that theory be? Even if it's perfect within itself.
Yeah.
Can you address that? So Georgism seems accurate within its own self, but it doesn't pull back to see the larger picture. And actually that's kind of representative of many of our problems, that people don't pull out and see the larger picture. Climate change, perfect example. We can just keep doing what we're doing, but you don't pull back and see the larger picture that's going on.
No, I agree with that. I think that's quite a reasonable way of looking at it. I think in some ways, Georgism is a lens as well. In some ways, I'm saying Georgism, but I mean, basically it's classical economics. It's a different way of looking at things. And the big difference between the classical economics of Henry George and our modern economics is that natural resources were built into the 19th century view of economics. When we say land, we're not just talking about the ground you stand on. We're talking about the light, the air, basically the entire universe. What we would nowadays call natural capital or natural resources.
And even the frequency like internet, frequency like, right. I don't know the terminology for it, but basically, you're allowed to use this bandwidth for television, for internet or whatever.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and that's a perfect example of the sort of thing that Georgists would consider to be land, although it's not what you would normally mean by the term when you're using it in everyday conversation. Mm-hmm. It's basically about the natural resources. I agree with what you're saying about the fact that it's too narrow. I think it's a focus because in many ways, as I said, you can expand the Georgist idea to include the government by basically saying the government is the prime landlord. And actually, if you look back to 1066 and sort of the Norman conquest of England or whatever, that very much was the case. I mean, King William I saw himself as the landlord of the country, and there was a hierarchy going down from him, which made that very clear. Landlords and sub-landlords, all the way down to the poor old peasant who was actually growing the potatoes or whatever. In some ways, it's a question of how you look at it. But I do think that, as I say, Georgism did not explain money very well. MMT does. And that's why I think there's a real place for synthesis there, you know. I know that Warren Mosler certainly, although he's not a Georgist himself, certainly the tax he normally talks about, the real estate tax. And most Georgists would be happy just to see that as a good tax. Maybe not a tax one, certainly.
Today I talk with Derek Ross on the basics of Georgism and its relationship to MMT. Derek's a Nova Scotia resident who's been a chorus member in theatrical productions for 4 decades, in shows such as The Pirates of Penzance by Gilbert and Sullivan. He and his wife also run a bed and breakfast. Derek was especially helpful in providing feedback for an introductory presentation I developed early this year. Although unfortunately the presentation never came together, it has many valuable concepts and analogies I still use today. Derek and I met in the Facebook group Intro to MMT, which is very busy and has more than 6,000 people, and for which I'm a moderator. Derek first discovered Georgism and later the work of Steve Keen, which ultimately led him to MMT. A main insight of Georgism is that taxing land is a much more elegant way to make a system that's both fair and more difficult to exploit. Although humans can manipulate and destroy buildings, they can't eliminate the land those buildings are on. As an example, I have a friend who's a general contractor. He tore down an old house and built a new one for his daughter. However, he left one wall in the old building standing, which prevented it from being legally considered as new construction, thereby avoiding extra fees and newer regulations. Land as defined by Georgism is not just the earth, but conceptual, like internet URLs and the bandwidth for television, radio, and cell phones. Taxes, or rents on that land, can be paid with money, such as interest for a bank loan or taxes for living in a country. They can also be paid with not money, such as by having to provide a certain amount of labor to the king each year or a percentage of the harvest. Going beyond Georgism, physics makes it clear that the most fundamental resource is energy. Resources and we are essentially forms of energy. In addition, all energy requires energy to find, gather, and process it. How you find, gather, and process food is very different than how you find, gather, and process gold, which is very different than how you do it for labor. Derek's provided several resources for those interested in learning more, and you can find links to these things in the show notes. Before the heart of our conversation, however, the first half of today's episode, part 1, is about the non-economic topics of music and musical theater. I'm a classically trained singer. And then solar panels and electric cars. Part 2 next week is entirely academic. If you like what you hear, then I hope you might consider becoming a monthly patron of Activist MMT. Patrons get super early access to almost every episode, and they also get the opportunity to ask my academic guests questions, and they support the development of my large and growing collection of Learn MMT resources, among other things. To become a patron, you can start by going to patreon.com/activistmmt. Every little bit helps a little bit, and it all adds up to a lot. Thanks. And now, on to my conversation with Derek Ross. Enjoy.